In the heart of Los Angeles, where dreams are built and sometimes broken, a single eviction notice would shatter more than just a lease agreement. Terrence Walker, a 32-year-old black professional, had recently moved into a sleek, top-floor apartment at Hawthorne Heights, an upscale complex in a gentrified Los Angeles neighborhood. Quiet and responsible, he always paid rent on time and kept to himself. One morning, as the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, Terrence sat at his kitchen table, reviewing legal briefs for a case. His apartment, a one-bedroom unit with large windows offering a view of the city skyline, had become his sanctuary. Though not cheap, it was worth the price. Quiet, secure, and conveniently close to his law office. A loud knock at the door shattered his focus. 3 sharp bangs. Impatient. Aggressive. Terrence set his coffee down and walked to the door. Through the peephole, he saw Richard Davidson, his landlord. The man stood with his arms crossed, his pressed button-down shirt tucked stiffly into khaki slacks. His expression was tight, his lips barely concealing a smirk. Terrence sighed before unlocking the door. "Mr. Davidson," he said evenly, "what can I do for you?" Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk about your lease violations," he said, stepping forward as if expecting Terrence to move aside. Terrence held his ground. "Lease violations?" Richard handed over a manila envelope, his fingers lingering just a little too long, as if enjoying the moment. "You've been hosting unauthorized guests, multiple complaints from your neighbors." Terrence raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting, considering I barely have visitors." Richard shrugged, his smirk deepening. "It's not just that. There are also noise complaints and reports of an unregistered pet. We can't have tenants breaking the rules." Terrence kept his face neutral, but inside, his pulse quickened. He knew exactly what this was. A pattern, a tactic. He had seen it before, subtle but deliberate, pushing out black tenants under the guise of policy enforcement. "I don't own a pet," Terrence said coolly. "And as for the noise complaints, I'd love to see the reports. Funny, no one has ever mentioned it to me directly." Richard's expression hardened. "I don't have to justify the complaints. We have a process, and the decision has been made. Consider this your formal eviction notice." Terrence took the envelope but didn't open it. He let the weight of the moment settle. He had handled enough housing discrimination cases to recognize what was happening. This wasn't about noise or guests. It was about him. "I see," Terrence said finally, nodding as he slid the envelope onto his kitchen counter. "And I'm guessing this has nothing to do with the fact that every black tenant I've spoken to here has had similar issues?" Richard's face twitched just for a second. "Watch yourself, Mr. Walker. I run this building as I see fit." Terrence smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that made Richard's jaw tighten. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Davidson," Terrence said, stepping back into his apartment. "Have a nice day." And then, without another word, he closed the door. Terrence leaned against the door for a moment, exhaling. He wasn't surprised, just frustrated. The signs had been there from the beginning. The delayed maintenance requests that never seemed to be an issue for his white neighbors. The rent payments that hadn't gone through until he sent proof of transaction. The way Richard always seemed to randomly inspect his unit but never anyone else's. It wasn't overt, but it was intentional. Terrence walked to his desk, flipping open his laptop. He had already started a file on Richard Davidson, documenting each subtle instance of discrimination. But now he had the eviction notice, and that changed everything. That night, Terrence lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He could fight this, of course. He had more legal knowledge than Richard could ever hope to understand. But this wasn't just about him. This was about every tenant who had been quietly pushed out. Every person who didn't have the resources to fight back. Every moment of injustice that had been ignored because the system was designed to protect landlords like Richard. Terrence turned onto his side, his mind racing. There was no rage, no panic, just clarity. He wasn't leaving. Not like this. The next morning, Terrence walked into the leasing office, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. Richard was sitting at his desk, flipping through paperwork. When he saw Terrence, his smirk returned. "Mr. Walker," he said, feigning surprise, "did you come to drop off your keys?" Terrence set the eviction notice on the desk. "Actually, I came to discuss this." Richard leaned back in his chair, sighing. There's nothing to discuss. The decision is final. Terence studied him, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it on the desk, his movements deliberate. This, he said smoothly, is a record of every tenant you've evicted in the past 5 years. Want to guess what they all have in common? Richard's smirk faltered. I don't have to listen to this. Terence didn't move. Every single one of them was Black or Latino. Every single one of them reported lease violations just like mine, and every single one of them had no legal representation. He tilted his head. Until now. Richard's face turned red. Are you threatening me? Terence smiled. Not at all. I'm simply letting you know that if you move forward with this eviction, you won't just be dealing with me. He tapped the folder. You'll be dealing with my firm, and the Fair Housing Act, and the press once they hear about this. Silence. Richard's fingers curled into fists. He was calculating, weighing his options. Terence could see it, the moment Richard realized this wouldn't be easy. Finally, Richard forced a laugh. You know, Terence, maybe I was too hasty. We can work something out. Terence nodded slowly. Oh, I'm sure we will. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. By the way, he said over his shoulder, you should look into hiring a lawyer. You're going to need one. And with that, he walked out. Richard sat there, his smirk finally gone. He had won battles like this before, but something about Terence was different. And for the first time, he felt like he was about to lose. Terence doesn't argue. He simply smiles, thanks Richard, and walks away. But there's something in his eyes, something Richard doesn't notice. The city buzzed under a dull gray sky as Terence sat at his desk, scrolling through emails. His apartment, once a place of quiet, now felt like the war room of an ongoing battle. The eviction notice still sat on his kitchen counter, untouched but not forgotten. He wasn't leaving, not when he knew exactly what was happening, not when he had the power to fight back. His phone vibrated, a new email. Terence clicked it open. It was from a former tenant, Jasmine Carter, who had moved out of Hawthorne Heights 6 months ago. Hey Terence, I'm glad you reached out. I still have the emails Richard sent me about lease violations. Same nonsense you're dealing with. I also kept screenshots of texts where he stalled my repairs for months. Let me know how I can help. Terence exhaled slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting. The first piece of real evidence? He glanced at the growing pile of files on his desk. Maintenance requests ignored. Emails never answered. Policy changes applied only to Black and Latino tenants. It was all there, clear as day. Now he just had to build the case. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts before pressing dial. The line rang twice before a smooth, familiar voice answered. Terence, to what do I owe the pleasure? Nina, I need you on a case. Oh. Nina Carter was one of the top civil rights attorneys in Los Angeles, and an old friend from law school. Tell me it's something good. Terence glanced at the eviction notice, then at the files stacked high on his desk. It's better than good. It's a lawsuit. Richard Davidson leaned back in his office chair, scrolling through his bank app with satisfaction. Another month, another 6-figure deposit. Evicting tenants was just business. New renters meant higher rents. Higher rents meant bigger profits. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called lazily. His property manager, Scott, stepped inside, shifting uncomfortably. Sir, I think we have a problem with Terence Walker. Richard barely looked up. What now? Scott cleared his throat. He's not leaving. Richard smirked. He will. They always do. Scott hesitated. That's not all. He's building a case against us. That got Richard's attention. His smirk faded as he sat forward. What kind of case? Scott swallowed. Discrimination, unlawful eviction. I heard he's been reaching out to former tenants. Richard let out a short laugh. Let him. You think one tenant is going to take me down? Scott shifted. Sir, Terence Walker isn't just any tenant. Richard frowned. Then who the hell is he? Scott hesitated before sliding a piece of paper onto the desk. A printed bio. Terence Walker, Harvard Law graduate, specialized in civil rights cases. Richard's stomach twisted. A lawyer. A damn civil rights lawyer. For the first time, Richard felt something unsettling claw at his chest. He had picked the wrong tenant to mess with. Terrence walked into the courthouse, his steps calm, his mind razor sharp. The lawsuit had been filed, and the battle had begun. He had been careful, methodical. He documented every interaction with Richard, collected testimonies, and gathered undeniable proof of discrimination. And now, it was time to make it public. As he stepped outside, a local reporter from the Los Angeles Times was waiting. "Mr. Walker, do you have a comment on the lawsuit against Richard Davidson?" Terrence buttoned his suit jacket, meeting the reporter's gaze. Housing discrimination isn't just illegal, it's a systemic issue that destroys lives. Richard Davidson has been targeting tenants based on race for years. It ends now. Within hours, the headlines exploded. LA landlord faces discrimination lawsuit after evicting black tenant. Civil rights attorney sues property owner for racial bias. Richard's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His lawyer, his investors, even his own tenants were questioning him. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. Richard paced his office, the walls closing in. The lawsuit had gone viral. Activists were protesting outside his building. More tenants were coming forward with complaints. Even his corporate investors were pulling away, worried about bad press. His lawyer, David Klein, sat across from him, looking grim. "Richard, we need to settle this." Richard scoffed. "Settle? Absolutely not," David sighed. "Terrence Walker has you cornered. The evidence is airtight. If this goes to trial, we lose." Richard gritted his teeth. "Then make him an offer." Later that evening, Terrence sat at his desk when an email popped up. Subject: settlement offer, Richard Davidson. He opened it. A six-figure payout, enough to make the lawsuit disappear. Terrence stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He closed the email. Then he called Nina. "He offered a settlement," he said. Nina snorted. "Of course he did. Are we taking it?" Terrence leaned back, exhaling. "Number, this isn't about money. It's about justice." Silence, then Nina chuckled. "That's what I like to hear. Let's bury him." The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, cameras flashing. Terrence sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Richard sat stiffly, trying to mask his unease. The judge entered. "Court is now in session." Terrence stood. "Your Honor, we have proof that Richard Davidson has systematically targeted black tenants for eviction while allowing white tenants to remain under the same conditions." He handed a stack of emails to the clerk. In these emails, Mr. Davidson explicitly states that he prefers to phase out black tenants to attract better renters. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Richard's lawyer paled. Terrence continued. "We also have video footage of Mr. Davidson selectively targeting tenants of color for lease violations. Violations that white tenants commit regularly without consequence." The judge turned to Richard. "Mr. Davidson, do you have a response?" Richard swallowed hard. His arrogance had cracked. For the first time, he looked like a man who knew he had already lost. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Davidson, I suggest you prepare for consequences." As Terrence walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him. He answered calmly, but inside he knew the fight wasn't over. Richard might be defeated, but landlords like him were everywhere. And Terrence? He was just getting started. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Richard Davidson sat at the defendant's table, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stare as he watched the judge rifle through a stack of documents. At the plaintiff's table, Terrence sat tall, calm, and unwavering. Beside him, Nina flipped through her notes, her expression unreadable. The evidence had been presented, the testimonies given. Now it was time for the verdict. The judge cleared his throat. "In the matter of Walker vs. Davidson Realty, the court has reviewed all submitted evidence and finds the defendant, Richard Davidson, guilty of discriminatory housing practices." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and somewhere in the back, someone let out a quiet, victorious, "Yes." Richard blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Guilty?" The judge continued. "The defendant is hereby ordered to pay $750,000 in damages to the plaintiff, Terrence Walker, and an additional $1.2 million in restitution to affected tenants who have come forward with claims of discrimination. Richard's lawyer, David Klein, paled. He turned to Richard, whispering something urgently, but Richard was frozen, staring blankly at the judge. Furthermore, the judge continued, due to the severity and pattern of these violations, this case has triggered a federal investigation by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The court is recommending immediate suspension of the defendant's rental license pending further review. Richard's breath hitched. His rental license, his empire, was slipping through his fingers. Nina leaned toward Terrence, her voice barely above a whisper. That's checkmate. The moment court adjourned, reporters surged toward Terrence, microphones and cameras flashing in his face. Mr. Walker, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think this sets a precedent for housing discrimination cases? Terrence buttoned his jacket, his voice steady but firm. This is bigger than just one case. This is about systemic injustice in housing, and today, the system fought back. Richard shoved past the crowd, his face red, his breath ragged. As soon as he stepped outside, protesters lined the steps of the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Fair housing for all," and "End discriminatory evictions." "Justice served, Richard," someone yelled. "Bet you didn't see that coming," another voice jeered. Richard stormed to his car, slamming the door behind him. As he sat there gripping the steering wheel, his mind raced. They're taking everything. The lawsuit was one thing. The money? He could handle that. But losing his rental license meant losing all of his properties. And the worst part? The federal investigation wasn't just about this one case. They were digging through everything. If they found more violations, it wouldn't just be his business at stake. He could face criminal charges. For the first time in his life, Richard Davidson was powerless. A week later, Richard sat in his office, eyes bloodshot, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. Legal fees were piling up, and investors were pulling out. Scott, his property manager, stood stiffly by the door. "We have to sell, Richard." Richard didn't respond. He just stared at the eviction notice on his desk, the same kind he had sent to Terrence weeks ago. Now it was his name on the chopping block. Scott hesitated before dropping another file in front of him. "The highest offer came in this morning. A property management firm wants to buy Hawthorne Heights." Richard's eyes flickered to the logo on the contract. His breath caught in his throat. Carter and Associates, a black-owned firm specializing in affordable housing and tenant advocacy. Richard let out a bitter laugh. The same apartment complex he tried to clear of black tenants was now owned by a black company. Poetic justice. He exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into fists. He had spent years building his empire, evicting tenants without a second thought, squeezing every last dollar out of his properties. Now he was the one being forced out. Terrence hadn't just won, he had changed the system. The sun was setting over Los Angeles as Terrence walked through the newly purchased Hawthorne Heights, now under Carter and Associates management. The energy had shifted. What was once a place of fear for tenants now felt like a community. He watched as workers repainted the walls, repaired broken fixtures, and installed new security cameras. Nina walked beside him, hands in her pockets. "Feels different already, doesn't it?" Terrence nodded, watching as a young mother carried groceries inside, no longer worried about an eviction notice on her door. "This isn't just a win for me," Terrence said. "It's a win for every tenant who's ever been exploited." Nina smirked. "And it's just the beginning." Terrence took one last look at the building, then pulled out his phone. He had calls to make, because Richard wasn't the only landlord running these scams. And Terrence, he wasn't done yet. Discrimination thrives in silence. Share this story, know your rights, and stand up against injustice.